Okay, so hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the monthly meeting of the New York City Neighborhood Naturalist Group, which is part of the New York City EcoFlora project. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow with the New York City EcoFlora project. So NYBG created the New York City EcoFlora project back in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The EcoFlora program is a community science project that has three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase understanding and appreciation of plant life. The program has since expanded to 4 partner gardens throughout the US: Chicago Botanic Gardens, Denver Botanic Gardens, Desert Botanical Garden, and Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. To date, in New York City, around 27,000 observers have made over 750,000 observations of plants and their biotic relationships in New York City and have posted those to iNaturalist. You can explore these observations on our project page on iNaturalist, which I'll link in the chat in just a few minutes. Each month, as part of the program, we also sponsor an EcoQuest challenge, which encourages New Yorkers to observe a particular species or group of plants and post those onto iNaturalist. So the EcoQuest for June is entitled Meet the Mints, which is focusing on species in the mint family, also known as Lamiaceae. So far, we've found 25 different species of mints. So I'm going to put right now into the chat a couple links about the project. Let me find it. So we've got, oh, did it not go? Sorry, try again. Okay, we've got our page on the NYBG website that has links to kind of stuff about the EcoFlora project and plants of New York City. Then we've got our iNaturalist project that you can see all of the observations that community scientists have made in New York. And the third link is to the EcoQuest for this month, Meet the Mints. So tonight, our speaker is Dr. Monica Palta, who is the assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Science at Pace University. Dr. Palta is an urban ecosystem ecologist and wetland biogeochemist who has conducted research in wetland, river, and stream systems in the northeastern, southeastern, and southwestern United States. The central focus of her work is on interactions between human infrastructure and activity and ecosystem functions and associated ecosystem services in aquatic ecosystems. In her talk tonight, entitled Wetlands and the City, she will talk about her research on urban wetland environments. Dense human settlements are typically situated in areas with wetland ecosystems due to the types of benefits or ecosystem services that these systems will provide for people. However, the explosion of urban growth in the 20th century has led to tremendous wetland loss. Despite over 90% loss of wetlands in some US cities, urban wetland environments persist and in some cases are gaining acreage due to either deliberate creation and restoration or inadvertently due to various water management practices. So tonight we will discuss the nature and extent of these remnant, restored, created, and accidental wetlands and the balance of trade-offs among services and disservices that these wetlands provide in cities in the Northeast and in Southwestern US. So please feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat as we go. And at the conclusion of the talk, we'll go through as many questions as we're able. If you have a question or comment that you would like to ask verbally at the end of the talk, at that point, when I open it up, you can use the raise hand feature or put a note in the chat and we'll make sure you have the opportunity to do so. Also, if you aren't able to stay for the whole talk or you would like to share this with others, a recording will be posted on our YouTube page, where you can also find recordings of our past talks, and I'll link that right here. So with that, I will turn it over to Monica.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to questions at the end, so please feel free to ask them. I'll be talking today about wetlands and the city, or wetlands in the city, wetlands for the city. Wetlands are really interesting and I've been studying them for a long time. So I'll start out my talk by posing this to you. the relationship between people and water is exceedingly complicated, and very much so in cities. So some of the earliest cities and civilizations developed on waterways. Mesopotamia is thought to be one of the places where early civilization developed. It was one of the first cities, and it was formed in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. So you can see from just this historic rendering of all of the uses of water that people have in cities and why we would situate ourselves close to cities. We need running water, we consume water, we use water for so many things, and there's so many functions that we capitalize on, from rivers in particular, but waterways in general. So this is basically the basis by which New York City developed. New York City used to be a giant estuary wetland environment, and because of the ability of the waterways around New York City to facilitate so much trade and provide, you know, a means of exchanging goods, and also you know, supplying water to the city with the many freshwater wetlands that existed on the island. We've of course built up New York basically all the way up to the water's edge. But, you know, we've also, by some estimates, lost between 80 and 90% of wetlands in New York because we have exchanged those wetlands for human development. And so there's been tremendous wetland loss as the result of all of the benefits that the wetlands provided in the first place. You know, we also have a number of issues that arise, not just wetland loss, but also the way in which we can degrade water quality in the waterways around us. So through our use of water, we also generate wastewater, which causes pollution. There are a number of issues with climate change, of course. So we are concerned about flooding in New York City. And this is a photo from Superstorm Sandy hitting New York City, which of course caused tremendous amounts of damage. We also have problems socioeconomically. You know, there's a difficulty in many communities with access to water. There's also a disproportionate concern of poverty intersecting with flooding and other dangers related to water. So very complicated relationship between people and water, even though we need it and we situate ourselves close to it. We're kind of creating these problems because of that. So most of our future growth as a human population globally is going to be urban. We are already very highly urbanized in the US. 80% of our population in the US lives in cities, and we're only going to be developing cities more in the future. And you can tell from where wetlands occur most predominantly within the US that most of the urban development that we're projecting is going to overlap with where wetland environments are. So it's really critical that we unpack this relationship between humans and wetlands and really think about how we can make that relationship more sustainable, which is what my work really focuses around. How can we mitigate this sort of damage that we're causing to wetlands and also benefit from them in all of the ways that we need to. So the reason that, as I alluded to in an earlier slide, wetlands provide kind of the basis for human civilization, and why we want wetlands and why we situate ourselves close to them is because there are a lot of ecosystem services that they provide. So I already mentioned that things like, you know, trade and movement can be facilitated by water, but wetlands in particular have a lot of benefits. So the fact that there is water in wetlands means that there's a lot of cooling that's provided by them. They provide a lot of habitat for wildlife. Importantly, they serve an important function with flooding. So they are able to dissipate water energy and thus buffer flooding. They also store a lot of water. So wetlands are really good at sort of mitigating flooding problems. They also have a lot of unique chemical processes that allow them to store carbon, mitigate contaminants, store nutrients and sediments. So there's like a lot of water quality issues that are mitigated by wetlands. And then of course, they provide a lot of recreational opportunities and aesthetic value to a city. So for this reason, exactly like I said, the fact that wetlands provide all these services, there are a lot of proposed wetland projects underway in New York City, particularly because we've lost nearly all of them. So here are two examples. One is the Big U project that's been proposed for Lower Manhattan, where we would build out wetland environments from where the buildings have sort of come to the water's edge and taken away the former tidal wetlands that used to exist. So there's an idea that that could be recreated in Lower Manhattan, particularly to buffer flooding and problems with sea level rise. Some of this wetland restoration project has already been done in Coney Island Creek. I was actually just there earlier today, conducting some field work with a student. And so there is some wetland restoration that has already happened there, and some additional proposed wetland restoration. So these are just a couple of the many projects that are proposed. So I mentioned that in my work, I'm really interested in facilitating more sustainable relationships between people and urban waterways. I mentioned already the number of stressors that we are concerned about when it comes to urban waterways and the people who are utilizing them. So the poverty and health issues that we find in cities, nutrient and pathogen loading in particular, so water quality degradation, and the issues that I already mentioned with climate change. These are all very pressing issues that require solutions. And in my work, I'm really interested in using urban wetlands as sort of to facilitate a more sustainable and more positive relationship between waterways and people, and almost serve as a means of buffering or mitigating some of these stressors that we find in the urban environment through those services or benefits that I already mentioned that wetlands provide. So I do a lot of work looking at and quantifying the kinds of benefits that wetlands can provide and how they may serve to mitigate some of these stressors. However, wetlands aren't uniformly positive in what they provide to people. There are some disservices that we're concerned about. And so when we are evaluating the benefit that wetlands can provide to people, we really have to think about not just benefit, but net benefit, and take some of these disservices or potential harms into account. And so that is also ongoing work that I am doing with collaborators that I'll talk about a little bit more. So the idea behind this, this research is that if we can figure out what the net benefit is of wetlands, how we can sort of manage the structure and function of urban wetlands most ideally to provide services and minimize harms or disservices, then we can use that in decision making. So we can have better management, better design, better policies around urban wetlands that can then feed back to, again, providing those benefits and mitigating the harms. So I'll talk about all of this, all aspects of this diagram and how my work kind of fits into it. And in my talk, I'll be telling a tale of two cities, or really a tale of two metro regions, the Phoenix metro region and the New York metro region, which includes parts of northern New Jersey as well. And I'll be talking about three kind of major themes, one being the gradients of intervention and on wetland environments and how they affect wetland function. I'll be talking about wetland ecosystem services and disservices, as I mentioned already. And then I'll talk finally about wetlands and social ecological resilience to climate change, how wetlands kind of fit into both social and ecological strategies toward the various impacts of climate change. So I'm going to start out with some early work that I did looking at how decision-making may be affecting urban wetland structure and function. And in order to give you a little bit of context for understanding this, I want to go through how wetlands are delineated. So wetland delineation basically means, like, from a management perspective or a policy perspective, how do we define a wetland environment? And first and foremost is hydrology. So wetland, wet land, basically there needs to be water. So the presence of water in an environment for 2 weeks out of the year is one of the criteria that we use for delineating or defining a wetland environment. So wetland hydrology, or the presence of standing water, is kind of unsurprisingly the biggest factor that we are looking for. And what we additionally are looking for is, with the presence of standing water, are we getting the unique soil features and plant communities that are characteristic of an area that has standing water all of the time? So wetland soils have particular physical and chemical characteristics that are driven by the fact that there is water on top of that soil. And there are also plant communities that are uniquely adapted to be flooded in their root systems at all times. And so we're looking for plants that are basically adapted to be in wetland environments. So those are the 3 criteria that we're looking for. And so if we go around to different parts of New York City, we see a number of environments that follow or that fall into these 3 criteria, where we find the presence of standing water, we find wetland plant communities, and we find wetland soils and soil characteristics. But these wetlands sort of range in what their history is, or what their intervention, what interventions basically led to their formation. So Pelham Bay in the Bronx, for example, is what we would call a remnant wetland. That is a wetland environment that predated Western settlement. And so this is one of the last remaining remnant tidal wetlands that exist in New York City, that was there prior to humans coming in and removing, over 90% of the wetlands that are in the city. There are also areas where, as I mentioned before, there's been some restoration efforts. So Perry Gap Basin, for example, is an area where there's been an active wetland restoration. There are a number of other areas that I mentioned before. And then there are also what I would classify as created wetlands. So that would be, for example, the Big U project that I mentioned before, where we're not really restoring a wetland, we are creating a wetland environment where there was no wetland before. And so, so there's this range of wetland types according to what their origin story is: remnant, restored, and created. In my work, in my early work, I identified a new type of wetland, though, that I termed an accidental wetland. So what are accidental wetlands? The created and restored and remnant wetlands you may be familiar with, but accidental wetlands are kind of a newer thing that I came across when I was doing my PhD research. So these are wetland environments that have all of the characteristics that I mentioned before: the hydrology, the soils, and the plant community that would delineate them as wetlands. But they are really novel ecosystems. They are resulting from human activity in the landscape, but they weren't intended to be created. They kind of just arose on their own for a variety of factors. So usually this is an abandoned part of the landscape. It's low-lying. The soils are generally kind of compacted, and so when water comes into that environment, it doesn't drain so quickly, so it kind of perches on top of the soil. And this allows the formation of those wetland soil conditions and those plant communities that I mentioned before. But these are really novel ecosystems because they're kind of self-organized. They make themselves. And so the soils might be urban soils, fill soils that were just sort of dumped there because of past activity. The plant communities just kind of come in and germinate in the soil and make themselves. And the water sources, as I said, are generally wastewater from the environment. So this isn't really entirely comparable to the other categories of wetlands that I mentioned before. And from my experience, I think that they are fairly ubiquitous throughout cities. I think that most cities probably support some type of accidental wetland environments, but they're very highly understudied because I just identified them a handful of years ago. And my work is really my early work especially was really focused on, are accidental wetlands structurally and functionally similar to native or constructed wetlands? We know that they have those characteristics that would delineate them as a wetland, but do they provide those same benefits or functions that I mentioned before that we so want from a wetland environment within an urban area? And so a lot of my early work was comparing the functions and the sort of characteristics of these wetlands with other wetlands in the same region that were native or constructed or restored in some way. And my, oops, sorry, didn't mean to skip over that slide. So the primary service that I was studying in that early work was the ability of wetlands to remove nitrogen. And so I want to talk just briefly about why nitrogen removal is such a critical function that wetlands provide. So cities in general have a lot of sources of nitrogen that more natural environments outside of a city would not. There's a lot of nitrogen that can cause ecological damage. So the ecologically damaging form of nitrogen is what we call inorganic nitrogen. It's the forms that you see the chemical formulas up here. Don't worry about that too much. Just know that nitrogen has a lot of different forms and can switch between them quite readily. And there's some forms that are more ecologically damaging and some forms that are less ecologically damaging. So the forms that are ecologically damaging are basically the forms of nitrogen that we find in fertilizer. And so, and I'll explain why that's a problem in a moment. But both the sewage system, so human waste and animal waste has a lot of inorganic nitrogen in it. Fossil fuel combustion can generate inorganic nitrogen that then falls in the form of precipitation. Leaves from street trees can actually leach inorganic nitrogen into waterways and go into the storm sewers. And of course, we apply fertilizer in cities just like we do in rural environments and agricultural systems. So the reason that nitrogen acting like fertilizer is a problem is because nitrogen pollution leads to a phenomenon that we call eutrophication, which is basically when we get these massive algal blooms in waterways that cause so much blockage of sunlight and decomposition, which strips the water of oxygen, that we get mass die-off of wildlife and submerged plants. So basically what's happening is we are fertilizing the water. The algae are going crazy, taking up this fertilizer and grow like crazy. And they ultimately strip the water column of oxygen and block out sunlight. And so this is very damaging to ecosystems. And these photos are actually from Jamaica Bay. This is something that is going on in New York City, this eutrophication problem, particularly in the lesser mixed areas of the estuary. Wetlands are really beneficial in sort of mitigating this problem of eutrophication because they support a process called microbial denitrification. So this is, again, a process that's carried out by bacteria. Don't worry about all of the chemistry if it's not something that you're super familiar with. But I just want to call your attention to this chemical formula here. So basically what we're doing is we're converting, we're not doing it, but the microbes are converting a damaging form of nitrogen, a form of nitrogen that acts as a fertilizer, which is nitrate, into these gas forms that are, in some cases, much less damaging to the environment. So N2 gas, for example, makes up 80% of the air that we breathe. It's not very biologically reactive. It doesn't cause eutrophication. And so this is a process that when we are building wetlands, particularly for water treatment, this is a process that's very highly desirable and usually designed for this process of denitrification. If you are at all familiar, though, with chemical formulas, you may already see built into this process some potential disservices or harms that are inherent to the process. So yes, denitrification converts nitrate to N2 gas, which is great. It prevents eutrophication, but it also produces CO2 and potentially, in some cases, N2O, and those are both greenhouse gases. So there has been some work that I've done trying to look at, is denitrification in particular wetland generating significant greenhouse gases as well as removing nitrogen. So that's a trade-off that we do have to consider. So this process happens a lot in wetlands. Wetlands are usually situated between upland environments, like you see in this photo here, and waterways. And so if it can intercept the water that's coming out of the urban environment before it enters the waterways and remove the damaging nitrate, then we can avoid eutrophication, which is great. So I was studying this process of denitrification in 2 accidental wetland environments that I identified in northern New Jersey. This was work that I did during my PhD. One was Liberty State Park, which I'm so excited to see that Klaus is on this call. Klaus has also worked extensively in the system, much more so than I actually, but I did get to work with him a little bit during my PhD. And so this environment is really interesting. It was an abandoned train yard in the mid 20th century and was fenced off and just kind of left alone. This site is in Teaneck, New Jersey, and was used as a landfill, a lot of different municipal uses. There was a lot of fill soil that was dumped on top of it. Both, as you can tell, are surrounded by this very heavily urbanized upland environment. And then, so these are, again, low-lying spots in the landscape compared to this upland urban area. So they're really capturing a lot of runoff that's coming from that surrounding urban environment. And then you may also notice that both of them are adjacent to waterways. So Liberty State Park is right next to the Hudson estuary here. Teaneck is right next to a creek that is ultimately a tributary to the Hackensack River. So again, both of these sites are sort of intermediary between densely urbanized areas and waterways that might suffer from eutrophication. What happened after these sites were abandoned and just kind of left alone in the mid-20th century was, again, they got wet because there was water coming from the surrounding landscape in the form of stormwater and precipitation. The soils were very compacted, so the water just kind of stuck around. Plant communities came in and, germinated in the site and sort of self-established. And so, voila, we get some accidental wetlands at both sites. And so I was studying both of these sites in terms of the wetland environments that were there and their nitrogen function. So, oops, meant to animate that, sorry. So just focus on the 2 diagrams at the top. So the question that I was asking again was, do these accidental wetland environments support denitrification? And to just give you a little bit of background on the soil environment at these 2 sites. So this is the Teaneck site. You can see these gigantic fill piles that were dumped onto the site. And so if we look at a more simplified view of what the soil profile looks like, we have this native clay soil that is the original soil that was at the site. These fill and debris piles that are also full of garbage that were dumped on top of the native soils. And then there are some lower lying parts of the landscape that have kind of a mix of organic material. They're flooded most of the time, so there's very slow decomposition of plant matter, and so that you get this kind of like peaty organic soil that's mixed in with the fill that's kind of eroded or run off of the piles during rain events. And so what I predicted, I was looking at these different soil types, and what I predicted was based on previous earlier research by Groffman and Tigi that found that when you have soils with a higher clay content, as in this clay loam soil versus a loam soil that has less clay, even as the soil dries out and more of the pores in the soil fill with air, so that's what the air-filled porosity means, you support a higher denitrification rate, which is what is on the y-axis here, than if you have a lesser clay content. And that has to do with the pore structure of those 2 textures of soil. The more clay that you have in a soil, the more tiny particles you have. Clay is the smallest soil particle that we look at in terms of soil texture. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about from these renderings. If there are smaller particles within the soil, it also creates these smaller pores that don't drain very well. And I already mentioned that, denitrification is a process that happens in wetland environments. That's because of the low oxygen that we find in low oxygen that we find in wetland environments. So denitrification really only happens when there's low nitrogen, or sorry, not low nitrogen, low oxygen in the soil, sorry. And low oxygen in the soil comes from it having water in it. So the more water, the more flooded a soil is, the lower the oxygen is going to be. And in clay soils, you have a lot of pores, even when the soil is pretty well drained out, that are still filled with water. So my prediction was that the native clay soil would be doing the best in terms of denitrification. I was wrong. The highest denitrification rates were actually in the crappy garbage-filled fill piles across the site, which was a very interesting finding. And I won't go into the biogeochemistry of why that's the case, but this was a very surprising and interesting finding. It really kind of spoke to the fact that these novel systems that we really see as just kind of junked up blights in the landscape are actually doing some really interesting things ecologically, and actually serving some very good benefits to humans, particularly in this case, potentially mitigating some eutrophication that could be happening in the nearby Hackensack River. So this map that I'm showing you here is some work that I did creating some spatial models. The blue is where you have these stormwater pathways running through the site. And then on the right-hand side of the site is the creek, Teaneck Creek, that runs into the Hackensack. And the red areas are the areas that support they're sort of hot spots for denitrification, support the highest denitrification. And you can see that the stormwater actually bisects these areas quite a bit. And when I ran some numbers, I found that that on the whole, the nitrogen removal that the site was supporting actually matched the most of the nitrogen that was being loaded onto the site. And that just 20% of the total site area was capable of removing all of the nitrogen, all of the nitrate that was coming in via stormwater and from the atmosphere. So very interesting that this kind of junky unintended site, and particularly the junkiest aspects of the site, were really proving beneficial in terms of nitrogen removal. So I carried out similar work at Liberty State Park. Here, there's a slightly different origin story. It was also accidental, but the soil profile in this case is a very highly compacted, very thick layer of fill soil. And then on top of that, you have this kind of railroad rocks. It's sort of like black coal rocks. And that's the soil profile. That's the soils on which these wetlands developed. So again, not the greatest conditions you would imagine ecologically, but still we have these thriving wetland environments. And I was comparing these small accidental wetlands that formed on top of the soil to a constructed wetland at the site. And what I found was that the accidental wetlands, once again, were supporting denitrification rates that were high enough to remove all the atmospheric nitrogen that was coming in. These sites are actually receiving mostly precipitation and not stormwater. But the constructed wetland was doing significantly better. That might have to do to some extent with the higher metal contamination in the soils at Liberty. And in addition to that, I mentioned earlier the trade-off that we're concerned about, namely that when we are looking for a wetland to support denitrification, we want that wetland to be making N2 gas and not N2O gas. N2O is a greenhouse gas, N2 is the gas we want. So if we look at the ratio of N2 gas to nitrous oxide, the accidental wetlands are producing far more nitrous oxide, i.e. the greenhouse gas, than they're producing N2 gas. So that's not great, but it's a pretty negligible amount, especially when we compare it to other emission sources like cars, for example. The constructed wetland is doing a lot better. So this was kind of an interesting finding too. At the Teaneck site, we have a junky site that's doing really well in terms of removing nitrogen. At Liberty, less so, although we're still seeing some functionality and some pretty severely polluted soils. So that's encouraging, but this is suggestive that maybe some measure of intervention and restoration can also be beneficial. So I'm not saying let's make all wetlands accidental wetlands, but we're finding strong evidence that accidental wetlands are doing a good job, and maybe with a little bit of assistance at some sites could do an even better job of providing benefit. So when I finished my PhD, I moved to the southwestern US to do my postdoc. So I'm going to be moving into some work that I did there. I just want to give a little bit of background on the wetland environments that I studied in Phoenix, or some of the wetland environments I studied. So this is a shot of an aerial view of Phoenix, Arizona. It's in the middle of the desert, of course. You may not think about the desert as having water or supporting wetlands, but there's actually a river, a natural river that flows through Phoenix, and that's the reason that that people settled there in the first place. So there are some very old ancient civilizations of Native American communities that settled this valley far before Western settlement. And so this is the Salt River. You can kind of see it from this aerial shot. What you may also notice is these big sort of blobs of water in the landscape. These are actually reservoirs that have been created by damming up the Salt River. So these dams actually capture pretty much 100% of the water in the Salt River before it even enters Phoenix. And so by the time you hit Phoenix, the riverbed is actually completely dry, and has been so for over 100 years when they built these dams. So upstream, all the water is captured, and then it's redirected through a canal system into Phoenix to provide running water and the drinking water supply and so forth to residents of Phoenix. So when I went to Phoenix for my postdoc, I was kind of like, okay, what am I going to study? I found these accidental wetlands during my PhD. That was kind of interesting. What can I do here? And I was just kind of looking on Google Maps, as I tend to when I'm trying to figure out what my next project is going to be. And lo and behold, discovered accidental wetlands in Phoenix, Arizona as well. So I mentioned already that the water is captured upstream in the Salt River of Phoenix. But what I noticed in the bed of the supposedly completely dry Salt River are areas that have water on them. So I thought, well, that's kind of weird. Those look like accidental wetlands. I wonder where they're coming from. They actually come from the stormwater system. So this is an overview of the stormwater pipes that go through Phoenix. And the red dots indicate where the outfalls are. So like where the open pipe kind of empties out its water. Phoenix is a very flat landscape. They are really very concerned about keeping water off of the landscape, particularly during the rainy season when there's a lot of flooding. The environment is very built up. There's a lot of impervious surface, so there's a lot of runoff generated when it rains. And so they very quickly shunt the water into the stormwater system, which then empties out into the bed of the Salt River. And again, this is a very highly compacted soil that we find in the Salt River. So the water just kind of perches on top and has created these wetland environments. So I was very excited to find accidental wetlands in the complete polar opposite climate and region of the US so that I could study them. And my initial work was really just concerned with, again, nitrogen removal. This is what I did for my PhD. So was studying the amount of nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen that we found in the water, both upstream and downstream of these wetlands. You can tell that they're kind of long and linear because they are in a riverbed, but they kind of start and end where the outfall is. So you can see where the outfall is in these diagrams and how the water comes in. And then just kind of peters out as you go downstream. So it's dry upstream and downstream of this long linear wetland. So I was sampling the water and analyzing it for nitrogen at the upstream and downstream point, both during storm conditions and during what we call base flow conditions. So base flow is when it's not raining, but there's just water coming in. And found that, yes, indeed, this accidental wetland, the top one was removing close to 100% of the nitrogen that we found as the water came in to the wetland. There's a little more variability in this lower wetland here, but again, close to 100% removal in some cases, sometimes lower, and during storms it wasn't doing quite as well as removing nitrogen. So this was very interesting. that I found similar kinds of nitrogen removal function in these wetlands that were in a completely different region of the US. So I'm continuing to do this work looking at what I'm calling this gradient of intervention, where I'm looking at these wetlands of different origins, and I'm very interested in exploring further beyond just nitrogen removal, what kinds of differences, if any, in functionality might we find. And I'm hypothesizing some differences because, across this gradient, there's more and more design and management when we get to the constructed or restored end. And some wetlands could be so narrowly designed that they don't really have the flexibility to provide the range of ecological functions that, say, an accidental or a remnant wetland were able to provide, because there's kind of less human disturbance and more self-organization in remnant and accidental systems. So maybe there's more kind of ecological complexity or more ability to provide ecological function because it's not humans that are using our narrow understanding of ecological function to design a system. We're letting a system kind of design itself. And maybe through that, we're getting more kind of what we would find in terms of natural function. So I've kind of branched out since coming to New York in looking at some other kinds of wetlands, namely restored and created wetlands, in addition to remnant and accidental wetlands. I've done some projects with students in Newtown Creek, where there's a lot of existing and planned green infrastructure that's designed for stormwater management, a little bit more so in the catchment. So like, put into streets or onto green roofs or things like that, rather than in the creek itself. But again, it's sort of adjacent to the creek and could possibly intercept stormwater and remove nitrogen before it enters the creek. In Coney Island, I already mentioned that there's been a restoration project there of some marsh areas. There's also an oyster reef that was put in by the Billion Oyster Project, and then there are millions of self-established mussel population of self-established mussels in the creek as well, that I was studying with an undergraduate student of mine. So very interesting systems that have both kind of restored and created and accidental features to them. So just to give you a bit of a background on New York, for those of you who may not be familiar with why, like where the majority of nitrogen comes from in New York City and why. In New York City, we have a combined sewer overflow system, which is a major source, probably the major source of water pollution in waterways in New York City. So during dry weather, this is a wastewater system that uses the same pipes for stormwater and wastewater. So whether it's dry out or it's wet out, we have one set of pipes that's dealing with wastewater and dealing with getting it to a wastewater treatment plant. So during dry weather, wastewater is coming from our homes, from us flushing our toilets, using our sinks, etc., and enters the sewage system, and through gravitational flow, basically, moves to a sewage treatment plant. What happens when it rains, though, is that the capacity of the pipes kind of reaches its maximum, because now you have not just sewage coming from houses, but you have stormwater coming through the storm drains into the pipes, and that causes these overflows. So some of the water is going to the sewage treatment plant, but whatever the treatment plant can't handle is just flowing out into waterways. And so we are getting untreated raw sewage, as well as untreated stormwater runoff that is going straight into our surrounding waterways. So that kind of gives you a context of where this pollution might be coming from and why. And my student Paris Baker actually did a nitrogen budget in Newtown Creek. This was a project that was done during pandemic time, so it was completely online based on published data. We were sadly not able to do any field work, but it was a really cool project. And in this project, she was able to confirm that yes, that raw sewage and treated raw sewage was definitely a major source of nitrogen to Newtown Creek. So that CSO system, when it rained, was contributing a lot of human waste that was untreated to the river, and And so that was a major source. Almost half of the nitrogen was coming from there. And treated wastewater, actually, a lot of our wastewater treatment plants, not just in New York, but everywhere, do not necessarily remove nitrogen. That's a pretty expensive and difficult thing to do. And there are no real requirements for nitrogen removal in a lot of cities by wastewater treatment plants. So a lot of nitrogen is coming from treated wastewater as well. And there's a very large wastewater treatment plant on Newtown Creek that is causing that to be the case. So a lot of nitrogen is coming from the CSO system as well as from wastewater treatment plants. So I've been exploring how these restoration projects and creation of green space and these interventions by humans might be assisting in removing nitrogen or mitigating it. I had two students who were doing work in Coney Island Creek. So again, we have these bivalve populations that have self-established and have been put in the creek. So Tatiana Graham and Tashina Maxwell were looking at this and found that there was a great deal of nitrogen, again, coming from stormwater outfalls in Coney Island Creek. There was some nitrogen coming in from the ocean as well as the tide came in. But even though there is, as we estimated, probably over 1 million self-established mussels in the system, I think there are a couple 100,000 oysters that were put in by the Billion Oyster Project. The removal that they're capable of, both through denitrification under their beds and the filter feeding that they do, is just absolutely negligible compared to how much is coming into the system. So very little effect on nitrogen removal by those introduced features and self-established features. Similarly, in Newtown Creek, there's all that green infrastructure that's being put into the watershed in order to remove, mitigate stormwater pollution. I already showed you that a lot of the nitrogen pollution to Newtown Creek is coming from the CSO system. But Paris's estimates of the nitrogen load to Newtown Creek, both with and without the green infrastructure, was essentially the same. So again, green infrastructure is having a very negligible effect. So we've been using these nitrogen budgets to really try to uncover not just what the functionality of these features are, but how the functionality actually matches up with the scope of the pollution problem. And I think this speaks to the fact that we can't just be looking at are accidental wetlands, created wetlands, restored wetlands capable of denitrification and nitrogen removal, but are they capable of removing enough nitrogen to make a difference in light of how much nitrogen is coming into the system? I want to point out that during my PhD research, I found that yes, they were capable of removing the nitrogen coming in, but it seems like in New York City, that's not really the case so far. So a little bit discouraging based on the work that we've done thus far. Okay, so just to remind you again of my organizational diagram, I've talked a lot now about how decision-making might be playing into the structure and function of urban wetlands and how it's influencing the services and disservices mainly related to nitrogen removal. I want to talk now a little bit more about how I've expanded this research on the services and disservices provided by urban wetlands to look at some other types of services and disservices. Again, wetland environments are capable of providing nitrogen and pathogen removal, wildlife habitat, heat mitigation and flood control. There are some disservices that are associated with each of these as well. I mentioned already that nitrogen removal is paired often with greenhouse gas production. Wildlife habitat is provided, but there are a number of invasive species as well that can self-establish in these systems or be introduced in some way. And I'll talk a little bit more about how if people are using wetlands as a means of heat mitigation, that there could also be some concern over exposure to pathogens and flood hazards, as well as legal persecution that is tied up with that. So as I said before, I focused on this set of services and disservices. I'll talk a little bit now about the quantifying the net ecosystem services, taking disservices into account now. So just to give a little bit of additional context on how these stressors kind of intersect with each other, I think that it'll become more clear how these ecosystem services and disservices sort of pair up and why they're important. So first, I've talked a lot about water quality issues, but you know, water quality issues are not kind of a stressor that is existing in isolation of other potential stressors. And this may have already occurred to you when you were looking at my description and explanation of the CSO system. You know, climate change is going to have a big effect on extreme events, namely droughts and floods. And so if we have a lot of pollution that is coming about as a result of you know, a wastewater and stormwater system, then of course we're going to have issues of climate change tying in with that particular stressor. So this is a long-term record that is taken from the Baltimore Ecosystem Long-Term Ecological Research Project. This is nitrogen export. So again, the nitrogen load that's coming through various watersheds in the Baltimore area. So up here we have various urban watersheds that are being monitored in Baltimore over time, and a forested watershed that they're using as a reference system. So you can see that when there was a record drought followed by a tropical storm, a tremendous amount of nitrogen loading coming from the urban watersheds. What basically happens is during a drought period, you have a buildup of chemicals and other sorts of things on surfaces in the city, in the urban environment. And then when it floods, everything gets washed into the watershed after building up for a long period of time. So this is particularly a problem in urban areas. You can tell that the forested watershed is considerably better at sort of buffering the effects of extreme events. One, because there isn't as many nitrogen inputs to begin with. I already mentioned that the city has a lot more nitrogen coming in to its waterways than native systems that are, you know, not developed. But the urban watersheds are not doing as well at sort of buffering this water quality problem. So you can really see the tie-in between those two things. This is something that I was looking at also in Phoenix during my work. So we also had a long-term monitoring program that we were carrying out. So up here you see the precipitation record and the discharge record in the Salt River. So this is again showing when the Salt River is flooding. The accidental wetlands are kind of supporting a lot less water. So you can't, this isn't actually zero. There's actually a little bit of water in the accidental wetlands even during dry periods. But when it rains, you see a lot of flooding in the Salt River because again, that pipe system is shunting all of the stormwater into the river. And I was monitoring both nitrogen that was coming out of the pipes and E. coli, which is a pathogen indicator associated with human and animal fecal matter. So you can tell that if you compare these records to when it is flooding and when it's raining, you can tell that there is pollution pulsing that's happening during rain. There's pollution coming in during base flow as well when it's not raining, but tremendous amount of spiking in pollutants during rain events. And this, I want to point out that the fecal coliform is on a log scale. So we're getting many orders of magnitude increase during storms. Pretty disgusting. And so there's a concern here, both you know, in all regions of the U.S., but maybe for a slightly different reason. So in the northeastern U.S., we're concerned about, you know, increases in drought and hurricanes, and how that might interface with both urban infrastructure and changes in land cover and impervious surface in terms of affecting water quality, like I showed you in the Baltimore record. And then also in the Southwest, we have our drought, probably an increase in droughts and an increase in intensity of the monsoon season. So the monsoon season is the rainy season that you saw in this previous slide, where you see the spiking and then this sort of like long dry period in between. So there's a summer monsoon season and a winter rainy season. And that is projected to be altered by climate change as well. And so again, when interfaced with the urban stressors of infrastructure and impervious surface, we might see significant increases in water contaminants entering waterways within this region. In addition to this, we're from an accidental wetlands perspective, a change in climate might actually mean that the accidental wetlands that I was studying and the associated services that come with them might be completely lost in Phoenix in the future. So I mentioned storm flow and base flow. Base flow is happening when it's not raining. And in an urban context, particularly in a desert environment, where the water is coming from in base flow conditions is from things like people washing their driveways, maybe opening a fire extinguisher. I mean, all of you have probably seen this during the summer in New York, or throughout the year in New York. There's always water going into the stormwater system because people are using water in the urban environment. And that is really what is sustaining the wetlands during dry periods, the ones that are around perennially. So this is work that was done by my graduate student collaborator, Amanda Suki, who finished her dissertation in 2016. What you see here is the precipitation record in Phoenix, which is in red. And these different lines that have letters next to them are all different pipes. So they're IDs of different pipes that are flowing into the Salt River. And you'll notice that some of them, basically when there is a line present, it means that the pipe was flowing. And when there's no line, it means that it was not flowing. So you can see that there's a mixture of perennially flowing pipes, which are flowing throughout the year, and then some ephemeral and intermittently flowing pipes, which are really just switching on and off when it rains, or maybe sometimes in between. But these perennial pipes, the ones that are flowing all year round, are flowing because people are wasting water in the urban environment. And if in the future you have people switching to being more water efficient, like if there's a ban on washing your car in your driveway, or people aren't wasting as much water in general, I mean, that's generally a good thing for the water supply, but we might completely lose the accidental wetlands that are being supported throughout the year. And Amanda's work, which I won't get into, I'm happy to talk more about it later, found that there are real significant differences in function depending on whether the wetland is perennially flooded or if it's just flooded for a few weeks or a few days out of the year. So this could have real consequences for the function that the wetlands provide. Again, a tie into climate that is really potentially important. So I want to talk now about, so that's kind of a background on the interaction between water quality and climate change and how those stressors are related to one another. I want to talk now about that sort of social component of poverty and socioeconomic disparity in cities, and how that sort of ties in with all of this. Because a big question in my research is how do we manage, urban wetlands to assist more vulnerable communities in managing and mitigating environmental stressors. And I just want to show you again, water and people, it's complicated. Human civilization started along waterways and it continues along waterways, and especially so for vulnerable communities. And I guarantee you that any waterway that you go to in a city is going to have homeless encampments by it, because that is the sole source of running water for a lot of communities. So again, to go back to Phoenix and just sort of show you this intersection, I'll be showing this downtown area of Phoenix, which is sort of disproportionately low income compared to the rest of the city. So the median household income is disproportionately lower than the surrounding environment. You also have a disproportionate number of heat-related deaths and illnesses that intersect with that low-income environment, largely because people cannot afford to have air conditioning on in their home, but also because there is disproportionately lower vegetation in the same area of the city. So the different colors on this aerial rendering are showing, the black areas are basically like concrete and impervious surface, and the green areas are showing vegetation. So you can tell how much more vegetated it is in the area surrounding that central area. And the reason for that is, again, like vegetation costs money to maintain. You have to irrigate it, you have to water it. it's not something that they are putting a lot of money and energy into in the central part of the city. You know, again, to give a little bit more context, this is a homeless shelter in downtown Phoenix. You can see how much concrete there is. There's very little green. The running water that's provided to the people in the shelter in the overflow lot, which is also used as part of the shelter, so basically a parking lot where people can put their sleeping bags, is this one hose in the corner with these carboys. This particular homeless shelter, which has since been closed down, is very close to those accidental wetlands. Again, this area of the city that's disproportionately poor, disproportionately concretized, and has disproportionate levels of heat-related illness and death, also intersects with that semi-dry bed of the Salt River where we find the accidental wetlands. And so let's compare this homeless shelter to what the accidental wetlands look like just a mile or so away. You can see how much more of an inviting environment this might be for people to spend time in, rather than sleeping in this, you know, parking lot next to some carboys for their water. And when I was going down into the Salt River to conduct my research on the accidental wetlands to look at nitrogen removal, which is like what's my, you know, that's my jam. I look at chemistry, and that's kind of what I went down there to study. But what I was noticing was I went very early in the morning to collect my samples throughout the summer, because that's when it's tolerable to do field work. And I would always find these little piles of clothing or blankets or something indicating that people were hanging out by the water, which makes a lot of sense. And so I was really curious to kind of explore this further, how this particular community might be uniquely served by these accidental wetlands. And so I collaborated with some social scientists to look at both biophysical ways in which the wetlands might be providing benefit, but also maybe some social ways in which the wetlands were assisting these vulnerable communities. So this is a graph showing the air temperature in Phoenix and the water temperature measured in the accidental wetlands at the same time. No big surprise from a biophysical standpoint that the water temperature is always lower than the air temperature. So this 1-to-1 line would mean that water temperature and air temperature were the same. Any dots that are falling below the line mean water temperature was lower than air temperature at the same time. So it is, of course, much cooler to be by the water, and that's why we're finding piles of clothing and people sleeping by the water. So people who cannot afford to have air conditioning in their home are finding probably a great measure of heat relief from hanging out in these accidental wetland areas. And the red area of the graph shows when Phoenix, those are temperatures at which Phoenix would declare a heat advisory. You can tell that the water temperature never got that high, but the air temperature did quite a few times. We also found that, you know, wetlands, there might be some disservices associated with the wetland and hanging out in the wetland environment. So yes, you're mitigating heat. There's some social, you know, emotional and aesthetic benefits that the people we interviewed articulated when we asked them about what they enjoyed about the or why they were spending time in the wetlands. But we found through these sort of modern archaeology experiments, I guess, we did these trash surveys and found a lot of evidence of human use that would put people in contact with the water. And as you saw on my previous slide, where I was showing the fecal indicators and how high they were during the storm season, this is a really big concern that people are, you know, brushing their teeth or bathing in this water that is just chock full of pathogens potentially when it's raining. So so there are, again, really important trade-offs to evaluate. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. So, you know, in New York City, I have been continuing some similar work looking at more vulnerable populations. This is a map showing where the brown dots are where the CSO outfalls are in New York City. You can see that they basically line the entirety of waterways that we have in New York City. So you can imagine how many pathogens and contaminants are coming out of those pipes when it rains. I've been doing work with my collaborator, Ann Toomey, who's an associate professor now, actually, just got promoted at Pace. who is a social scientist, and she and I have been doing work in the Harlem River and in Coney Island. So to give you some demographics on those communities, to just show how, again, the vulnerability index, Coney Island and the communities that we've been studying in the Harlem River have a disproportionately large population of immigrants and low-income people compared to the rest of the city. And so we've been really interested in looking at, again, the types of ecosystem services or potential disservices that might be affecting those communities in these areas. And so our work so far, we've done a great deal of work in Coney Island, particularly Coney Island Creek. We're still working on writing up the data that we collected in the Harlem River this last year with our students. But our general findings have been that these systems are very heavily polluted with pathogens and nutrients, so there is a concern there. But the communities find just tremendous cultural meaning and importance in these systems, and are using them very extensively in myriad ways, and unfortunately in ways that put them in contact with the water. So a lot of fishing and boating and things like that are definitely of concern. So there's that trade-off to consider, but these systems also have these potential future threats to existing uses and meaning, because there are these infrastructure and development projects. So this was just rescinded and shot down. They're no longer going to do it, but there was going to be a ferry terminal that was put into Coney Island Creek that was a big concern to the community. There's a boathouse going into the Sherman Creek side on the Harlem River, and there's a lot of concern by the communities of gentrification and of cleaning up these waterways so significantly that rich people will want to use them is a concern. So there's a lot to balance there and consider, and that's some ongoing work that I have with my collaborators. So there are a lot of management implications from this body of work, namely that urban wetlands, even those that are really degraded and haven't been restored or designed, do support native wetland processes. And urban wetlands do provide many functions and related services, but we do have to be careful in looking at when those services are provided and what kinds of disservices might be paired with them. And interestingly and importantly, management goals for vulnerable populations may need to be very different than other communities. And to this end, my collaborators and I have been working a lot with various management agencies. We do a lot of work, in the community. Again, thanks to and to me, my social science collaborator, who's great at this kind of thing. And I'm happy to talk more about that too, if anyone is interested. So hopefully I've given you a good idea of how these different sort of components fit together in my research. And just to show some future proposed research, we're still waiting on whether we get this grant funded or not. But we are now collaborating with even bigger teams of people, again, Antumi and I, looking at how we can sort of put together models that predict both hydrology, ecosystem services, and human decision making. So to kind of combine all those things that I talked about earlier that I've been looking at more individually in the past. So fingers crossed that this gets funded. So a ton of people to acknowledge. Thank you so much, especially to my undergraduate and graduate students who are amazing. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me or reading more about the work that I'm doing, again, with my collaborator, this is our website, and you can find my publications on ResearchGate. And that's the end. Sorry. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You covered a lot of great information, and I think that everyone definitely has a lot to think about now. I know something that I was thinking a lot about with the eutrophication. I had actually taken an environmental policy class at Fordham University a few years ago, and I had written a paper about eutrophication, but a lot of it was I focused on like in agricultural runoff.
Yeah.
because I think that that's been studied a lot, and that's like a big source. But in this kind of instance, that's not the main thing there. But there's so many. I was surprised when I found out how many CSOs there are.
Yeah.
And we actually had somebody from the Bronx River Alliance last year that came and talked about specifically that they've been looking at the Bronx River with the CSOs and taking water samples, and also finding that same kind of thing, that there's these big surges and they'll cancel some of their like stewardship that they have on the river if the fecal levels get really high.
Right. Right.
And it's kind of I guess the thing is, first we have to collect all this data to kind of prove, even if we all know that some things are problems, to kind of prove that they're problems, to then be able to implement like solutions, or if solutions can even be found. And that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think solutions absolutely can be found. I think it's a question of sometimes there's just not enough public awareness that this is a problem. I mean, I feel like I horrify my students every year when I tell them about the CSOs. They have no idea that this is even a thing in New York. So I think that people are not, again, I was in Coney Island Creek today. There are people fishing. There are people wading into the water. I mean, that is just, my students and I have been finding cryptosporidium in that creek. It's like, people just aren't aware. And again, this speaks to the unfortunate reality that vulnerable communities are sort of disproportionately utilizing these systems also, and have even less information, I would say, than the general public about these issues. So I think it may be a question, I don't know, this is just my personal opinion, but I think that, wealthier individuals don't have to directly interact as much with the environment, and it's not as big of a concern for them that they can't swim in the East River, so that they're not worried about it.
Right. And so we have some questions that people have put in here. One that's kind of related to this from Ellie about the advanced sewage treatment systems that exist. So like in Battery Park City, that there's some, I guess, for things from the 90s, and that LA has some sewage treatment for potable water. What effects those things might have?
Interesting. I can't say that I know a lot about that. I know from so I mentioned before, I mean, I can speak a little bit more to the nitrogen part of it. I have been starting to go a little bit into microbiology now, but like it's not really my main focus. So like pathogens is kind of a newer thing that I'm studying. So I'm not as aware of those treatment methods, but I know that with nitrogen, most wastewater treatment plants, like I said, do not remove nitrogen, because you basically have to have special ponds and pools that have denitrifying bacteria in them, and like create the conditions for denitrification and so forth. So they're utilizing denitrification technologies at wastewater treatment plants to remove them. And I know that the Chesapeake Bay, where there's like a lot of septic systems that are not on kind of like a main sewage treatment network, are building like denitrification tanks underground that the septic system goes into. So there are definitely really interesting technologies being developed. I can't say that I know as much about them, or the engineering aspect of them, but I definitely think that that's, I feel like I also heard about some sort of nitrogen treatment technologies that are being put into the pipes that are going into Long Island Sound. That was very fascinating, but I'm not sure. It might be like creating some kind of biofilms in the pipes or something like that.
Interesting. And of course, then the implementation of that stuff is, how much it costs, at what scale.
So costly. Exactly. It's mostly been pretty small scale. Yeah.
We have another comment in here from Ira about sulfur, that one of the diagrams mentioned sulfur, and that is there any smell in some of these areas, or is there any like sulfur compounds that are, could have some kind of effects?
Oh, yes, yes, there's definitely, yes. I study invisible stuff for the most part, and so I can't go out into the environment and ID a bunch of plants and birds, but I always tell my students, like we go by smells and and like colors. That's kind of how we do our like field bacteria identification. But yeah, that you can definitely smell sulfur. Just when I was earlier in Coney Island Creek, you can smell that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's again a natural wetland process, the reduction of sulfur and that smell that's generated in wetlands. Sulfur actually does interact with the nitrogen cycle as well. It's not something that I'm doing work on, but I've had colleagues who have done really interesting work on how sulfur kind of plays into that as well. But yeah, you can, I mean, smelling the sulfur is always exciting. You can say, oh, reduction is happening. That's like the chemistry field work part.
And that could be another way to kind of keep out, as Klaus just put in the thing about the gentrification of wetlands. I think if there's something
Yeah.
sulfur smell, that's gonna drive away some people.
True.
We have another question from Karen Reeds about mosquitoes. And so is there anyone that's tracking mosquitoes in these different wetland types and based on those weather events with, I guess, with standing water, what effect that has?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely one of the bigger disservices that we would be concerned about with wetlands. So in Phoenix, I know that the health department does do periodic, surveys and testing of mosquitoes down in the wetlands, and they have found instances of West Nile. I know that in the Northeast also, there's been, some concern over mosquito-borne illnesses and some tracking of that. What's kind of interesting though is that there has been some interesting research done by my PhD advisor and others at Rutgers that showed that the mosquitoes that are in wetlands tend to have a lower disease load than the mosquitoes that you find in like backyard environments. And I think that's again because of the more complex ecological interactions that are happening within wetlands. Like you're more likely to have like bats and birds eating the mosquitoes, and you have like less exposure of the insect. I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert on disease ecology really, but I know that there's a buffering effect with higher biodiversity. So the more biodiverse the environment is, and the more intact the food web is, generally lower the disease load. So there's been some really interesting work. Yes, wetlands provide mosquito habitat. Yes, they can support disease vectors, and that's of concern. But it's been interesting to see that human infrastructure has demonstrably worse disease loads, and could possibly serve as more of a disease vector than wetlands can. But that's not letting wetlands off the hook. It's definitely something that's important to look at. But yes, that is monitored by various agencies.
And it's interesting also because you touched on this before as well about this kind of, we can do our best to restore or reconstruct, wetlands, but we, at least at this point, can't create that kind of complex system in the same way that it is if it's kind of accidentally or naturally created. And that's a really interesting kind of thing to try to understand more.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the components of that? Because right, if you just kind of go and you dump some substrate and you try to, I'm sure that there's much more, it's much more involved than that, but that it's still not quite the same.
Yeah, definitely. And in some cases, I use like the example of the LA River a lot. That if you have some sort of infrastructure that you've introduced, that the closer to infrastructure and the more managed something is, the more narrow its function, right? Like the LA River was meant to shunt water out of LA, and that was it. And if that's the only kind of thing that something's designed for, then how limiting are we being toward other sorts of functions? And I think the same could apply to these wetlands. Like, are we making them too, are we meddling with them too much? You know, is there such a thing as too strong of a human hand in terms of environmental management?
If anybody has any other questions they might want to ask.
I saw a few in the chat. So I could definitely get, so my PhD advisor was Joan Ehrenfeld. I'll type that into the chat. If you just search for Joan Ehrenfeld and like West Nile or mosquitoes, like you'll probably find that research. Yeah, it was very interesting research that was done by a team at Rutgers. And then there was another question on any limits on nitrogen outputs from wastewater treatment plants. No, there aren't. The EPA has very strict concentration guidelines for certain pollutants, like heavy metals, for example. So like they'll say like, you know, the air, this air pollutant can't be higher than this concentration in the air, or you can't emit X. But nutrients, interestingly, have a descriptive, the EPA's guidelines for nutrients are descriptive rather than like concentration based. So instead of saying like nitrogen can't be above this concentration in the water, they basically say if, you know, nitrogen is considered too high if it causes algae to grow too much. Like, it's very, very vague. And the reason for that, I get the reason behind that, basically because nutrients act different ways in different environments depending on what is limiting in that environment. You can't just uniformly say like not higher than this. But yeah, eutrophication is really complicated to manage for that reason. And that's why wastewater treatment plants don't have necessarily strict guidelines on how much nitrogen they can let out. I think in the Chesapeake Bay, actually, they've been a little bit better about that. They had so many problems with eutrophication and dead zones that they have started requiring the wastewater treatment plants to treat for nitrogen. But yeah, great question. No, I mean, New York City is starting to implement some of those technologies too, but not at all of its wastewater treatment plants, and not nearly enough. So
I guess it would also require them to have then facilities to test exactly how much. And
yeah, and they do. They actually do monitor that, and that's how Paris was able to do her work, her online work, because the wastewater treatment plants are obligated to publish all of those data. So they do monitor nitrogen, but there's no like cap on how much nitrogen they're allowed to let into the rivers here. That they can just, but they are monitoring it, to be fair. Someone asked also about the dams on the Bronx River. My master's work was actually on dams and dam removal. I'm against dams. That's all I'll say. Dams are very environmentally damaging. So as much as we can get rid of dams, the better, in my opinion.
And I see there's one that Kevin just asked. I'm not quite sure if Kevin, I don't know if you want to unmute and maybe ask about this.
Oh, yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
A lot of streams were taken away. They were put in pipes, but they're still there. There's a good example is Tibbetts Brook in Yonkers or Bronx, and they're going to be sunlining that, so the stream is going to be flowing again. And I'm wondering if you've thought about this, and if there are any candidates in New York City proper where you think that this might be something that we can do here, or if you've even thought about it.
Yeah. So daylighting streams is, I think, generally a really good thing. You know, pipes aren't really providing any, again, pipes have like one function, which is to get water from one place to another. So when you open those pipes up to daylight, they have more potential to act like a stream would. So they can be colonized by certain types of organisms and bacteria and potentially even plants and things like that. So I would say definitely daylighting pipes is a good thing. I don't know about any particular pipes in New York City or any plans to do that, but I feel like I was at a Parks Department meeting, or I feel like that is something that is being talked about, but it's not something that I specifically know about. Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to wetlands, which is that, you know, there's a new comprehensive plan that was recently released by the Parks Department and others. And so there's really a lot of interest in, you know, how can we maintain the wetlands that we have and bring new wetlands back. And, you know, if you could hook those wetlands up to daylighted pipes, like that would be even better. But yeah, I don't know as much about that. I know there are a lot of limitations in New York in general, just space-wise. Like, you know, so many pipes are underneath sidewalks and streets, and like, you know, people seem very unwilling to kind of relinquish property in New York because it's, you know, at a premium. So yeah, I think the challenge is space.
All right, we're going to try to squish in these last few questions before we run out of time. So Ira was asking, what kind of wetland would you classify the Bronx River as?
Yeah, let's see, do I have the oh, here we go. I actually had a few extra slides just in case some additional questions came up. So so this is the historical Bronx River watershed. It used to be mostly swamp. Sorry, this is so blurry, but these are all different kind of wetland habitat types. You can see now how incredibly built up the watershed is. So there's very little green space. The development is like pretty much all the way up to the river, but they are doing some wetland restoration in the Bronx River. I think that it's like just along the edge though. And in the areas where they've completely paved over and built all the way up to the river, any wetlands they introduced, I would consider constructed, just because like they eliminated the wetland and now they're like putting a wetland back there. But there are some wetlands that would be probably destroyed more, or restored, not destroyed, more in the headwaters. Like you can kind of tell there's like some green area around the upper part of the watershed, where there are parks and so forth. And I think that they are doing some restoration of pre-existing wetlands there as well. So,
and I guess there could be even kind of remnant like around NYBG and the zoo and stuff, where they have, it's been kind of preserved in some capacity.
Yeah.
Through all that kind of development.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right, and our last one from Sarah, could you talk more about the role of the permits for managing point source nutrient pollution?
Yeah, I think that so I'm not as familiar with the permitting process. I did have a master's student a few years ago who was doing policy, who was looking into wetland policy stuff. I think a little bit less familiar with nutrient policies. I know that in Westchester they've completely banned the use of phosphorus fertilizer. Like I know that non-point source nutrient pollution, they've made some efforts to manage just by banning certain things in fertilizers, at least outside of New York City. In terms of discharging from like, you know, again, I would say that probably wastewater treatment plants would be like one of the biggest sources of nitrogen in terms of a point source, and maybe the CSOs as well. I mean, the CSOs are already in violation of the Clean Water Act. Like the outdated sewage system that we have in New York City is something that I believe New York City has to pay the EPA fines for every year, because we're violating, you know, when raw sewage goes into the water, like we're violating many chemicals that aren't just nitrogen. I don't know that there are. I don't know about permitting for nutrient pollution from point sources. But I like I said before, if you're interested in that, you may want to do some poking into the Chesapeake Bay, because I think that they have more strenuously tried to issue more of that, like point source permitting for nutrients. I don't think they've done that in New York, but there are so many. That's like one of so many different fish to fry in terms of pollution. So nutrients are definitely. I would say emerging as a bigger problem in New York now that they've gotten a better handle on cleaning up some of the Superfund sites. There's more permitting on like metals. They are aware of the CSO problem and trying to do stuff about that. And so I feel like the glaring thing that's being ignored is nutrient pollution. So I kind of feel like in the next couple of decades, nutrient pollution is going to take over in New York as being the pollutant of the most concern. Because they're doing a really good job of taking care of a lot of these other pollutants, particularly since the Clean Water Act was passed. But the Clean Water Act really doesn't address nutrient problems, and so it's better at point sources, and it's better at pollutants that are not just regulated through descriptive regulatory pathways. Like just not too much nitrogen is basically how it's regulated. There's no like maximum. I don't think there's a TMDL for nitrogen in New York.
Well, and maybe also this thing with the overlooking the nutrient pollution is because there's not as much of a like primary risk to human health as much as there is with kind of like heavy metals or like toxins. Whereas this is something that like it does have a huge effect, but it's not as like readily apparent, or it's not until there's like a huge algae bloom or something that they're like, oh wait, this is not good.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Monica, again so much for coming and talking to us. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for all your great questions.
Comments.
Yeah.
We will have this the recording up and posted on our YouTube page, hopefully within the next week or so. And stay tuned for the announcements for our next month's talk. Continuing our urban biodiversity and etc. kind of themes. And hope everyone has a great night and everyone stay safe. Thanks.
Thanks so much.